speaking with Donald A. Henderson, Professor of Medicine and a member of the Center for Health and Biosecurity at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Dr. Henderson, maybe we could start by having you tell us a little bit about where you were born and educated.
I was born and brought up in Cleveland, Ohio. Went on to college at Oberlin, and then medical school at the University of Rochester. Following that, I did an internship at the Mary Imogene Bassett Hospital in Cooperstown, New York, for 1 year. But then I'd been deferred from service, uniform service, since 1956. And they called in 1960 and suggested, well, not quite right, but they called and said, you go. As right after internship. And so you had your choice of going with any of the uniform services. Mm-hmm. And the question, as I looked at it, was Army, Navy, or Air Force. That I assumed with a 1-year internship, I'd be doing entry-level physical examinations or something like that. It was very dull. When a man showed up at the hospital and was looking to recruit people for the Centers for Disease Control, none of the staff knew the Centers for Disease Control. In fact, it was very small at that time. They didn't even have a permanent building at Emory at that point. And it was for the Epidemic Intelligence Service. So he explained how we would have a month's training in epidemiology and biostatistics. They would be faculty from the School of Public Health at Hopkins. At the end of that time, we'd be blessed as epidemiologists, assigned to various posts, some at the center, some at state level, a few at university. And we were then on 24-hour call to be ready to go to any epidemic wherever it may be.
Right.
So that, as I wound up on my posting, was to be Assistant Chief of the Epidemic Intelligence Service, which was described to me as a gopher job. But in this case, I'd be working closely with Alex Langmuir, who was the director. Alex Langmuir was a legend at that time as an epidemiologist. An outstanding man, very, very good, very, very difficult to work with many people, very demanding. But it seemed like that might be a time I really could learn something. So immediately, at the end of the month, I was assigned down to Phoenix City, Alabama, for a diphtheria epidemic. And I spent the month down there seeing pseudomembranes and all the rest of the diphtheria. I'd never seen it. I knew nothing about it. Came back and found the chief EIS officer was packing his bags. And I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "Well, I'm now the health commissioner for the state of Alabama." And I said, "What do I do?" And he said, "Well, I guess you must be the chief EIS officer." And that was it. So I wound up as being with one internship, that was 1 year of internship, that being a sort of number two to Alex, and sitting in on various meetings, early meetings on polio. I would be with him on some of those. And occasionally I'd be going to take notes when he couldn't make it. And it certainly was an introduction of unique character. Alex did turn out to be difficult to work with, but he was an extraordinary teacher. And I would count that as my real mentor. And that time in the Epidemic Intelligence Service, that 2 years, we really had I had a number of interesting epidemics which were superb and intriguing because, well, at diphtheria in Alabama, I wound up in Argentina in a botulism outbreak and happened to see some smallpox cases for the first time. there were others. We had clam hepatitis on the eastern seaboard. We had one thing after another. And each of these was a real challenge because you had to draw on knowledge and skills of a whole lot of people trying to put together a magnificent, difficult puzzle.
Right.
And each one was different. And from that, I began to think very seriously about going into infectious diseases. So that was the turning point with Alex Langmuir. And before that, I was going to be a cardiologist.
Wow, big difference, right?
It was.
How many years did you work with the EIS?
Well, I was 2 years on this task, and then we put together a 5-year training program to keep people in. And so I decided to take 2 of those years and get 2 more years in internal medicine, which I did at the Bassett Hospital. In the 3rd year, I got a Master of Public Health degree and came back in 1960 to CDC and was put in charge of what's called surveillance section. At that time, surveillance section we were all engaged almost wholly on surveillance of viral diseases. So in 1957, we had the pandemic flu that came, which was a great adventure. We were looking at hepatitis and trying to get some knowledge of the spread of that. And this was a time we began to get involved with smallpox. We hadn't had a case in the United States since 1947, I think it was. But we were vaccinating all children on school entry had to be vaccinated. There's a concern in the US and in other countries as well that smallpox might be introduced. People had not been vaccinated for a long time. There was no clear idea of how long protection really lasted. So we were concerned about an importation. And if it did come in as chief of surveillance section, I would be a central figure in trying to do something about it. So what I decided to do was to send one of my epidemic intelligence service staff to each outbreak in Europe. In the 1960s, we had a lot of importations from Europe into Europe. And so for us to get educated on what was being done, what was working, and how we might proceed, I sent somebody along for most of these outbreaks that we could learn and gather from that. And this was my introduction to smallpox was sort of incremental at that point. We decided at that point that we're going to have to do a lot of vaccinating if there is an importation. And at that point, we were working with the military, with the jet injectors, which they were using for subcutaneous inoculation. We asked the question, could we do smallpox vaccination that way by changing the direction of the head so that a shot of the vaccine would kind of go in tangentially? We experimented with that. Sure enough, it did work. So that you could vaccinate, in theory, as many as 1,000 people an hour. Well, you can't move people in a line at that speed, but the idea was you could vaccinate a lot of people. And that then led to undertaking some studies of how many vaccines could you give at the same time, safely, and with efficacy. So we began working with measles, with smallpox, with DPT. Some of this was done in Brazil, some of it in Central America, and finding that it was amazing how many different antigens you could give with no more in the way of consequences or severity of reactions to the individual then was from measles, which was our most reactogenic vaccine at that time. So that led us to do a number of studies with smallpox. And we set up a study to try to see how the jet injectors would be in a very large population. So I think it's a bit of a boondoggle, but we arranged to do this in Tonga in the South Pacific, which is a very nice place to do it, very good cooperation. And that was a study that was done there, and this was a man by the name of Bill Fagey, whom you may know, was his first trip outside the country to another place. He was in the smallpox unit at that time. So that led to that series of studies, and we began then to look at other things with regard to smallpox. So gradually, I was learning a lot about smallpox simply because of the threat that was there.
So that makes a lot of sense for why at some point you got involved with the eradication effort. And of course that many people know you very well associated with that. So how did this experience then transition into, that was a program initiated by WHO, is that
Well,
correct?
this is a strange story of how it did happen, actually. 1959, the Russians returned to the UN. They'd been out. They came in, and the deputy minister proposed at a World Health Assembly that the world do global smallpox eradication. Everybody wanted to please the Russians, and that they're there, they made a suggestion, let's respond. So they voted, yes, we'll eradicate smallpox. And they assigned then about 4 people and maybe $100,000 a year after that, and not much was getting done. The Russians were furious about this and felt that more money should be put into this, and they were donating vaccines, nobody else was. And so every year they were complaining to the Director General about this. Well, meanwhile, we were working, there was a Merck with Mari Hilleman had developed the measles vaccine and tested it in, at that time I was Upper Volta. And then they vaccinated at their request, all of the kids in the country, and then they persuaded AID to make vaccine available for 9 countries in West Africa, Francophone countries. AID came to us and said, could I, after having a year where things went badly, they said, can you assign 9 people, 1 each to 9 countries while we get measles vaccine started in each of the countries with a 4-year program, and then we turn it over to the country. And this made no sense at all. The countries were so poor, they couldn't afford 10 cents a dose for yellow fever vaccine. And here's the measles at that time, vaccine cost $1.75, I think it was. There's no way in the world they were going to be able to continue the program. I was kind of at a loss to know what to do. We wanted to work with AID. They were very helpful in giving our officers experience, and so decided, let us put together a plan that we would be happy with. And we decided they could maintain a smallpox vaccination program, because smallpox vaccine at that time cost between 1 and 2 cents a dose. So if we combine smallpox and measles, this would be something that at the end of 4 years, maybe they stopped the measles, but the countries would have something to continue on with. But then as we looked at it, this group of countries is scattered, and they're nomads roaming this whole area. And it just didn't make sense to do this with just these selected countries. But you take a whole block, it'd be 18 countries, which would include Nigeria and Ghana, the Anglophone countries. So we put together a plan to do measles and smallpox together. And our earlier studies, we could show that these could be given together at the same time. not mixed, but in different shots. And so we put the plan forward, and it was for, I think, $35 million. The AID was planning to spend about $5 million. But I didn't know what to do. And so we figured, well, we'll put it forward, and that'll be a departure point for negotiation of what we could do. I couldn't afford to have 9 people leaving from my little staff of, I don't know, 15, 20 people, I mean, for 6 months. Well, much to our surprise, President Johnson became aware of the program and said, accept it. So all of a sudden, we had this program with 18 countries of West Africa. And Alex Langmuir at that point, who was working for his deputy really, he said, what have you done? This is terrible. We've never run a program outside, CDC's never had a program outside the United States. We don't know how to run it. This is going to require an enormous number of people. We really don't know what we're doing here. How could you have gotten us into this? I said, Alex, they weren't supposed to accept the plan. And he said, well, it's your responsibility, and I don't want any part of this so far as the epidemiology branch is concerned. So I then reported to the head of CDC. At any rate, we went to work and figured 15 months would mean getting agreements for 18 countries, getting vaccine. We had to have U.S. vehicles. There wasn't a U.S. vehicle distributor in the whole of West Africa. It was getting all of this together and contracting, training the people. We had French training in preparing of vehicles and what have you. It was a madhouse. And in the middle of this, the Director General had decided that he was angry with the Russians and wanting, this Smallpox program, because at the same time malaria eradication was along about its 10th or 11th year. It was obviously much more expensive, much more difficult to do than they had, and it was failing, and Africa was posing an impossible problem. He felt they were blaming him and WHO, and the last thing in the world he wanted was a second eradication program. And these facts I just learned much later. He decided to submit a program, a plan, to the World Health Assembly, calling for smallpox eradication in 10 years, that he would ask $2.4 million more from the WHO budget to cover that every year, and that would be it. It went to the World Health Assembly. There were a lot of people who said, look, we've tried malaria, it doesn't work, eradication doesn't work. In fact, there's a book written about this time on this whole thing. And others said that 2.4 million would have represented, with, I don't know, currency exchanges and so forth, would have been some percentage, like 10% increase in the WHO budget, which really was quite small at that point. So they said it's too much and we don't want to put the money into it. And I had put the plan together on behalf of the Director General and laid out the plan. And I assumed it would go down the tube, as everybody else thought it would. Well, it got into the Assembly, and in the Assembly you do not usually vote. Things are decided by accord. And this came head to head and went on, the debate went on for 3 days, and they decided finally to take a vote. And it passed by just 2 votes. So all of a sudden smallpox eradication was in the WHO agenda.
What year roughly was this?
That was precisely 1966. And the program was to begin in January 67. So the Director General, as he saw it, the U.S. had been partly responsible for this thing going through. And in fact, the U.S. had just announced it's supporting programs for 18 countries for totally other reasons. But he blamed the U.S. and basically he said, you got us into this. And when this goes down the tube, in so many words, I want an American heading the program so that the U.S. will share the responsibility for this debacle. And so I got called to Washington by the Surgeon General, and he said, you're going to Geneva to head the Smallpox Program. And I said, no, I can't. I've just got this program started in West Africa. And there's a lot of people that I made personal commitments to get them aboard. I cannot go. And I said, besides which, in the Public Health Service, we don't order people around like you do in the military and talk about career development. And he said, right, this is your career development assignment. And I said, and if I refuse? He said, you resign. So I got the impression he was serious. And so we packed up 3 kids, my wife and I, put half of our household goods in storage because it would be just 18 months. And then I'd be back. And the deal was I'd do 18 months and we could come back again. And 11 years later that we unpacked the household goods as I was in Geneva then for the next 11 years.
Wow. But this was a global eradication program, not just Africa as you had originally
That was the
envisioned.
Global Eradication Program.
And 11 years later, it was done.
It's done.
And so in those 11 years, give us a sense for what you did.
Well, when I came in, the budget was $2.4 million. That was not enough to buy the vaccine. We needed roughly 250 to 300 million doses a year. The U.S. offered to provide 50 million a year to West Africa, and the Russians were providing 25 million a year for program. It left a lot of vaccine. I thought when I came in, because all countries had to do some vaccination because smallpox was such a problem, that I figured, well, there's smallpox vaccination going on in a number of different countries. But data we had were just about zero. The reporting was terrible. There'd been an expert committee 2 years before who said we really can make no statement about smallpox because the data are so bad. We don't know what's happening. So at that later on, we were able to go back with surveys, and we figured we were dealing with roughly 10 million cases a year at that time, with 2 million deaths. With programs, we had about 43 countries that year that eventually we found cases, and roughly we figured we had about 50 countries that we were going to have to do programs in. So it was a real challenge because communication was a real problem. You've got no email. You can't use telegraph because it's really much too expensive. So it was mail that had to go, or visiting, and that was the only way you could move things around. With that many cases, or that many countries, it was a fantastic challenge, and we really wondered how we would get this thing off the ground. But there were problems that had to be solved bit by bit. And part of this, the major changes came about because we were doing research. And there are many who say, well, you must have gone out and just vaccinated everybody, and that was the answer. Well, it was certainly not the answer at all. The problem with malaria eradication before was that as a deliberate act, they had stopped the malaria research, closed the laboratories, and went ahead. I think the statement was, we know what to do, it's an administrative matter to go out and do it. And in all candor, polio was not so different. When we got into polio eradication. There was no research. But I made the pitch for it, and finally they agreed that they would assign $40,000. But I was so young, I don't know, 35 years old, whatever it was, that they couldn't possibly make that all available to me. It'd have to be overseen by somebody more senior, $40,000. Well, we got a lot of help from CDC, and we got a lot of help from Professor Marenikova in Moscow in their laboratory there. They put a lot of effort into it. I think one of the first problems we had to look at was the vaccine and solve that, and that came as a real blow. We felt we needed to have independent monitoring of the doses of the quality. And the Rijksinstituut in Holland and the Connaught Institute in Canada at that time volunteered to test the vaccine. And what we found was that less than 10% of the vaccine met standards. And a lot of it, we couldn't even detect virus in it. But they were going out and doing, quote, vaccination. So the first thing we had to do was try to find, how are we going to get enough vaccine? We couldn't buy it. The U.S. was at sort of maximum production, so was Russia at that point. So the only thing we could do was then to use the different laboratories in the different countries. We brought together 5 vaccine producers. 2 weeks later, emerged with a manual that I could understand. Then they went back out and worked with the different countries to laboratories. And we continued the monitoring through a quality control. There was work done in shortening the time of these were vaccine, I should go say, was made by shaving the side of a flank of a calf.
Right.
And then you made scarifications in it, slathered the vaccinia on it. 7 or 8 days later, then you would have the pustular material coming out. At that time, you killed the calf and you scraped it off and basically bottled the vaccine. It's basically what it was. So that these different laboratories were being developed rapidly, and UNICEF provided a machine which had been developed at Lister Institute, which would permit you to do that on a manufacturing scale, freeze dry it. So suddenly we were turning out vaccine which could withstand 37 degrees Fahrenheit for a month. And this just sort of changed the dynamics immediately. Otherwise, you couldn't take vaccinators into the field when the vaccine was there before.
Right.
It was dead within 3 days. So the vaccine came along, and within 5 years, I think we had more than 80% of the vaccine was being produced in the developing countries. But the most striking discovery was what we call a bifurcated needle.
It's on the cover of
The
your book,
picture of
right?
it on the book. Actually, it's only about that long. It's very short. It's a little less than 2 inches long. And you took the needle, and the idea of this was developed at Wyeth Laboratories. And you could take the needle and you dipped it into a vial of vaccine, and you withdrew it. And as you can see, that needle has a little drop in it. That's
Right.
vaccine. That would be enough to vaccinate the individual. And then the vaccination in the US, what we used to do was take on the arm and you put a drop of vaccine and then you gently pressed it into the skin. And you were told it was not to draw blood. If it drew blood, then the vaccine would not be effective. So you had to be very careful in applying it, but this was the way it was. This would be really to get it out of the vial and onto the skin. And we looked at it and I said, what happens if we just do this and turn the needle this way and make multiple punctures? And so we tried it, and every one of these would have a little drop of blood coming out. But every single vaccination was successful. So what was taught in the medical teaching at that time was that if it bleeds, all the virus washes out. In fact, it was a sign that you got it in deeply enough if it showed some trace of blood. So Wyeth agreed to grant us at no cost for the cost of the needles, so no patent costs. We had them made up in huge quantities. And within 3 years, we had converted all of the countries into vaccinating in a totally different way. And you could teach a villager to do good vaccination within 15, 20 minutes. It was very easy to do. More than that, the vials of the vaccine came in little vials of about 1/4 milliliter. And with the standard method, you could get 25 doses. It was 0.25 mil. With a needle, we could get 100 doses. So all of a sudden, our vaccine shortage problem shrunk by fourfold,
Right.
because all of a sudden we were able to use this new technique. So they say it's one thing after another on the research that changed the character of the program. Another big discovery, important discovery, was how long would a vaccination prevent disease. And the commented technique, they said, was 3 to 5 years was the standard. Well, in the surveillance program, and this was our strategy, was not only to vaccinate 80%, but what we decided we wanted to do was get a report from every health center every week. It was a totally new idea, which I had no idea whether that was going to work, and I had my doubts. But parenthetically, we were able to do that in virtually every country within 18 months. Yet every one of them reporting every week. In response to this, we'd send out a team, usually of 2 people, and they'd vaccinate around the individual. We called it containment vaccination. And with that, the protection, the protective level that you acquire with the vaccine as it's given, within about 5-6 days, you are protected from subsequent entry of the viral virus. So by vaccinating then the family and villagers around, you started stopping outbreaks. And suddenly the outbreaks started coming down rapidly, and they weren't spreading it. And so we were the surveillance containment technique, which was brand new, but derives from Alex Langmuir. And me being head of surveillance section, what else could we do but surveillance? So that was a dramatic change. And finding then, as we did, we would get on each patient name, age, sex, date of onset, village, and previous vaccination or not. Well, with vaccination, as you know, you get a little scar, so you can tell whether somebody's vaccinated. So the reports kept coming in, and we had a fair number of adults with smallpox, but none of them were vaccinated. And so we got a couple of teams to get into this in more detail to validate this, but it was quite clear that we almost never saw a case in an individual who'd been vaccinated, even 10, 15 years before. So with that, instead of planning a program that had to come back every 3 to 5 years, we get to them once.
Yeah.
They're protected.
Right.
And this changed the dynamics of the program dramatically. So again, it was a discovery
Yeah. Sure.
that you had from this. And I only emphasize it because I was so discouraged with polio that it was not doing more during the early days than it did to really characterize it, because it made a big difference in how this program changed and how we got things involved here. But those were a couple of the major changes, and we learned a lot of other things. One of the important things, though, that we found was to get people into the field. And so we made as a rule that everybody in the program had to spend 1/3 of the time in the field. And I did too. And we'd go out, and we'd go to villages, we'd check with the vaccinators, the supervision. It wasn't a valid sample we were taking, but you got an idea of how well things are working or being communicated. So I, with all the rest of our staff, did travel frequently in the field, and this made a big difference. It made a big difference, I think, at the country level, that these people are coming from Geneva or wherever, and it's important. Therefore, the program must be important, because when we went out in the field, then you get somebody from the minister's office, somebody from the state level. There'd be a whole entourage of people. A nuisance, but absolutely it made a difference. And this brought us, I think, a lot of good participation and people who would work day and night on the program. And when we got a number of people, as we did, from different countries working together, it made a bonding which was unique. And the way we were recruiting, I had somebody in the Soviet Union who were referring people, somewhere in Czechoslovakia, another one from Poland, UK. We had the CDC was providing people from the US. So over the period of time, I think we counted roughly 650 who had served in a capacity for 3 months, 6 months, a year. Some of them stay on for a couple of years. But that was all we had. And if you think about it, we had the number of countries we had. We never had more than 150 WHO external staff in the entire program, in the field at any time. So most of the work was actually done by the countries themselves. And this, I think, made a huge difference as well. We weren't sending in a lot of people taking their jobs or doing what they might be doing. They had to do it. And this made a huge difference. And I can't say enough about the people who worked in the program. Absolutely dedicated. And even today, we just had a meeting in Pan American Health Organization this last week, and I think there were 6 or 8 people who'd served in the program 35 years ago and had to come and see me because it's all they'd done for a year, 2 years, but it meant so much to them. And as they said, my life changed. I had a different, you look at the smallpox program, it was a heck of a lot more than just vaccinating a lot of people. And we set out on this to do it in 10 years. Totally arbitrary. I think it was a French delegate who said, John Kennedy has said we're going to land a person on the moon in 10 years, and so why can't we eradicate smallpox in 10 years? Simple as that. We missed it. and I'm still angry about it. It was 9 months and 26 days we missed it.
Not bad.
But we would have gotten there. But the Somalis had cases of smallpox, and they suppressed them. And we had trouble finding out about it. But finally we found it. And so 10 years, 9 months and 26 days, that was the end.
Yeah.
And then following that, we were in each country, we had a series of steps that had to be taken before we would validate it. And this involved reporting. So we had to have data every week, and we had many of them reporting measles cases, so that we would have some reports coming in, and you'd know who was reporting.
Right.
And for problem areas, we would then have special teams. And at the end, we would have an international team who would come in with the instruction to go and review the data and then go into the field. And the pace on this was set by the Director General from Indonesia, who said to the group that we brought in, I know you think there's smallpox here. You go wherever you want to go. I will be sure you can get there. And you ask anybody you like. You will not find smallpox. But everything is open. And sure enough, the man from Australia, who came from the hospital, Fairfax Hospital, he said he knows where it is. He even knows where in Jakarta the cases were. So he went there and spent the best part of 2 weeks. And he came out and he said, there is no smallpox. But my mates will never believe me. So it was a rigorous bit and brought us up to the end of the program.
It's a remarkable story, which you've documented in this book, Smallpox, the Death of a Disease, by yourself. I just want to ask you one more question related. We're trying to eradicate polio right now. What are your thoughts? Do you think we're almost there? Do you think we can do it?
Well, I preface this for, it was May 1980 that the World Health Assembly passed the resolution saying eradication has been achieved. In September, there was a meeting held at NIH, and basically it was entitled, "What Next Do We Eradicate?" And Frank Fenner, who was a very senior virologist from Australia, who worked very closely with us, he and I were giving the opening talk on it, and I think basically I said at the time, as did he, that we saw no disease at this point in time for which we have the tools and the will to eradicate. We were very sensitive, I think, about it because of malaria. Malaria program failed, and it had repercussions which were enormous. That many countries just folded their programs, and there was a resurgence in a number of countries of malaria, and it really set back control programs very seriously. Money for malaria control dried up, and you couldn't just go into an eradication program and expect to have no consequences from this. So that's what we said in 1980, that we saw no, and I was never invited again to an eradication conference. I don't think they wanted me there. But we came to 1988, and I think it's worth noting for the polio group. There was a meeting held in Talloires, France, some months before the World Health Assembly. And it included the heads of the various UN agencies and major donors. And the proposal was that we eradicate polio and that this come before the assembly. And I was a rapporteur on what was being done. And I was very unhappy with this. And my view was quite simple. You have a vaccine which has to be kept cold up to the point of use. We know what it's like distributing vaccine of smallpox, where we didn't have that. It was difficult in a large part of Africa and Asia getting the vaccine out to the people who had to use it, let alone at a cold temperature. Secondly, you've got a vaccine which we could give one vaccination, and there's protection there. If we're in an area, and we were in areas where there was civil war and fighting and what have you, but if you could get things quieted down for a brief period of time, you could vaccinate a lot of people. You're in good shape. With polio, you couldn't do that. So at that time, there was a very frank discussion about it, and I finally said, I will sign on and agree on this eradication, provided that there is a research program set up to produce a much more antigenic, heat-stable polio vaccine. Otherwise, I don't think it can be done. And nothing was done. So we're still dealing with the same vaccine that we had in 1988 and struggling. At the same time, there's an enormous amount of money that's gone into it. We calculated the amount of money that was spent on the entire program of smallpox over the 14 years and translated into today's dollars. And it comes out to very close to $1 billion. Right now, we're spending more than $1 billion a year on polio, so that it's a major investment that's involved here. There's another problem with the measles that worries me or the polio that worries me very much. Polio was born out of the expanded program on immunization, which actually we had initiated out of the Smallpox Program and got it through the Assembly in 1974. And it was from that Ciro de Quadros, a Brazilian genius, I would say, working with PAHO, set up the expanded program of immunization in the Americas, and demonstrated very clearly that you could eradicate it, or let's say eliminate it throughout the Americas with the tools available. He set up the model for that, and the expanded program on immunization was set up specifically for DPT, measles, and polio, and BCG. That was the idea, that this would be a set of vaccines that we would promote for all countries. UNICEF picked this up in about 1975, 76, began supplying vaccines, and the consequence has been in the Americas dramatic. As you know, they interrupted measles transmission in the Western Hemisphere, rubella. The rubella syndrome is gone. And it's been just a miraculous achievement that's really not yet fully understood just how great it was. And it was because of Ciro and what he was getting done in the Americas that it gave a lot of courage to say, okay, we can do this worldwide. But you don't have many Ciro de Quadros, and it's a lot more difficult working in Africa logistically than in the Americas. And so the polio program was really a major leap. And the question is, did we have the technology to do it? Did we have the commitment to do it? With Bill Gates weighing in heavily on this, and actually Bill Gates and I and Ciro had a couple of lengthy meetings. It made a huge difference. We never had support like Bill Gates has provided in the polio program. with that and with the commitment of so many countries, it seemed like maybe you could make it, but it was going to be extremely difficult. Now, since then, we've gotten the Shabab in Somalia, we've got the problems up in the Pakistan border areas, we've got the northern Nigeria block with Iran there, and we confronted with smallpox a number of very difficult circumstances, but none quite like this is that they have at the present time. So when I look at it at this point, I'd like to say to all the people who are working so hard and have invested so much, and Rotary has been particularly notable, that I hope you're going to succeed. I'm with you, but you have got a very high mountain yet to climb.
Dr. Henderson, thank you so much for talking with us. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.